Good morning, church. It is good to be together, and I hope you've enjoyed the sunshine this morning. This is our first freezing morning of the season, but it's almost feeling like it's fall, I guess. So what can I say about that? We are glad that you're here, and if you're visiting with us, you're certainly our honored guest. Encourage everyone every week to get a copy of The Messenger. The Messenger has sermon information on the front. You can fill in the blanks and actual order of worship inside. This week we have an insert with various new members. Congratulations to Alyssa Bloom, who was baptized this past week. And so take a look at that. Take a look at all the announcements of various things that are coming up. Pancake breakfast, you may be hearing more about that before we get out of here. But always pick up one of these if you're visiting with us. Encourage you to go to our Welcome Center, get some information there, leave it with us if you will. Another way we can get to know one another is just by, meeting and greeting. Why don't we try that? If you see someone you don't know, introduce yourself. If you're a visitor, then the visitor say, "Who are you?" or something like that. But let's take just a moment. Let's stand up, speak to the folks around us. We'll begin in just a moment. Again, it is good to be here this morning, and I hope you're enjoying the beautiful sunshine, the changing of the seasons in Middle Tennessee. I start out with a story about a man who is late for his golf game on Sunday morning. Usually he's with his buddies on Sunday morning playing golf. They were getting ready to start without him, and he arrived, and he explained, "The reason I'm late is because I woke up this morning wondering maybe I should just go to church, go to worship service instead of playing golf. But I decided to leave it to a coin toss, and the reason I'm late, I had to flip that coin 11 times before it came up tails, golf. So here I am." I hope you've never thought about assemblies that way. I hope you don't take these for granted. But what I want to focus on is partly these times together, but also when we leave these doors as we look at the idea of spiritual bodybuilding. I do want us to see these times together as times of not simply coming to a place, but times in which we participate in an activity, an ongoing building up activity. And to help us, we're going to look at the gathering times in the first century. And when we turn to the scriptures, perhaps there's no more in-depth look at the church coming together than what we find in 1 Corinthians. I encourage you to turn to 1 Corinthians. We're going to be there in just a moment as we really begin in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And I want to point out a couple of things in particular about the gatherings of the church. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. It was a city, a church that was having all kinds of problems, and especially even within their assemblies. Two things in particular that I'll point out as we begin. In chapter 11, Paul points this out. The church at Corinth was having a problem with koinonia. And that's a Greek word, which I normally wouldn't put that up on the screen, except it's interesting that that word is translated with two different English words. One is fellowship, and the other is communion. Our meet and greet, that time together, you could use that word to describe it. What we've just done now with the bread and the cup, you could also use that very same word to describe that, our communion. As a matter of fact, the church at Corinth, their fellowship problems sort of bled over into the way that they were observing the Lord's Supper. They would come together, it was for that purpose, but oh no, not at all. They would have meals, and the rich would be segregated over here, and the poor might not have all that much to eat. And Paul goes at them and says, "That's the Lord's body? That's the Lord's Supper? I don't think so." They were not only having problems with communion, they were having problems with fellowship within the church. And in particular, he brings this out in chapter 14. They were struggling in the area of edification as well. And the word edification simply means building up. There wasn't much edification. There wasn't much building up when the church came together. They were neglecting to use their time together for that particular purpose. Now, in the case of Corinth, what that centered around was the use of spiritual gifts and tongue speaking in particular. Listen to the way that Paul addressed the problem. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. I'm going to be using the NIV this morning. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He utters mysteries with his spirit. But everyone who prophesies speaks to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. He who speaks in a tongue edifies, builds up himself, but he who prophesies edifies or builds up the church. I'd like for every one of you to speak in tongues, but I'd rather have you prophesy. He who prophesies is greater than he who speaks in tongues unless he interprets, so that the church may be edified or built up. And when Paul is talking here about prophecy, it's really about proclaiming a divine revelation. It's a lot more about forthtelling than about foretelling or seeing the future. And in this context, when he talks about speaking in tongues, he's talking about someone speaking in their own native language, one that can be understood by others without an interpreter. Then he adds in verse 12, since you are eager to have spiritual gifts, try to excel in gifts that build up the church. Now, there's one thing in particular that we see in this passage, and it's this. Whenever we come together as a church, we need to be looking for ways to build one another up. That is one purpose of our coming together week in and week out. Now, when you look at this, some people might think, well, Paul, aren't you placing an undue emphasis on us and on people, on the ones who are coming to worship rather than the one who is being worshiped? I understand the question, but let me say something about this and about God and worship. I've said it before. God doesn't need our worship. He's God. That's your good news this morning. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need anything from us, anything we have to bring Him. You could bring Him the blood of millions of bulls and goats, and I'm telling you, it wouldn't take away sin. I think I heard someone talk about that recently, but check it out. I also remind you of Paul's words from Acts chapter 17 and verse 25. God is not served by human hands as if He needed anything. So understand this, when we come together to bring our worship to God, we are not giving Him anything that He needs. He's self-sufficient. He is God. He needs nothing from anyone. He has deep desires. He desires for us to love Him. He desires for us to follow His will. But He doesn't need us. We, though, on the other hand, do need. We have all kinds of needs when we come together. And we certainly need the encouragement and the building up that we can give to one another when we do come together. Because it's the way that God has made us. He's made us to need this from one another. That's the natural course of events. And in verse 26 of this same chapter, Paul repeats his admonition. All things must be done for the strengthening of the church. It's all about that. It's all about the church. You say, so it's all about us. When I say church, you do understand I'm talking about the body of Christ. It's all about Jesus. Why did Paul say that everything is about the strengthening of the church? Well, I think if you look at Corinth and 1 Corinthians, there wasn't a lot of spiritual bodybuilding that was going on in that church, and especially in their assemblies. They would come together, and they were way more focused on themselves, and by themselves, I don't mean the body. I mean individually. Each one of them was focused on my own needs, what I want, the way I want it done, than they were on certainly God, and even on the ones who were right beside them in the same place. They had certainly lost the idea of edification, of building up, taking place within these times together. That particularly held true with the presence of visitors within their assemblies. I'll remind us that when we come together every week, we need to be aware of those with us who are not part or yet part of this body of people, not part of this particular place. If you find yourself in that category this morning, we welcome you here. we do every week. We are honored always to have visitors and guests with us. Listen to Paul again. We're going to go pick up with verse 12 from 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Since you're eager to have spiritual gifts, try to excel in gifts that build up the church. For this reason, anyone who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret what he says. If I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what shall I do? I'll pray with my spirit, but I'll also pray with my mind. I'll sing with my spirit, but I'll also sing with my mind. If you're praising God with your spirit, how can one who finds himself among those who do not understand say amen to your thanksgiving, since he does not know what you're saying? You may be giving thanks well enough, but the other man is not built up and edified. I thank God I speak in tongues more than you all, Paul said. But in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Let me jump to verse 22. Tongues then are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. See what he's doing? He's focusing on those who are not yet part of the body. They're a sign for unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is for believers, not for unbelievers. If the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and some who do not understand or some believers come in, will they not say, you're out of your mind? I don't get it. I don't understand. These people seem crazy. Back to the text. But if an unbeliever or someone who does not understand comes in while everybody is prophesying, he'll be convinced by all that he's a sinner. He'll be judged by all, and the secrets of his heart will be laid bare. He will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. As you look at that 25th verse, we'll put this up on the screen. What happens in our assemblies should prompt even a guest to proclaim, God is really among you. These times together, they are extremely important, and they go beyond simply, if that's the right way to say it, simply coming together to worship God, for us to give our worship to God. As a matter of fact, one thing that God is calling for when we come together is this: looking at each other, not just looking up, but looking around as well. And even visitors, those who are not yet part of this body, when we come together, they ought to be built up by what happens at this place week in and week out. They ought to be able to understand what is going on here, even if there's some unfamiliarity to it as far as that goes. That's one reason we have our order of worship every week. Just something to help guide through what's happening in the morning. And here's the song, and here's the prayer, and here's the fill in the blank, whatever it might be. That's one reason from time to time we do what we did this morning. Just a little meet and greet, getting to know one another, and just bringing it down to this human level. That's why we have a welcome center. So we have visitor packets that explain a little bit about us. What we're trying to do, one of our missions, is to be visitor friendly when we come together. It's not just some in club, some tight-knit, closed group, and no one else is welcome. And why? It's in order to gain a hearing for the gospel of Christ. It's all about that. We do what we can to expose people to the gospel of Jesus. And the truth doesn't change. But ways of getting people to listen or to get them where they can hear, those things can change all the time. Technology changes. We need to be aware of all of that. Now, having said that, we need to be member friendly as well. We need to understand when we come together that also is part of our mission if we're talking about spiritual bodybuilding. Again, meeting and greeting, and I've mentioned tongue-in-cheek more than one time, 100 times. I don't know. You have the great fear of meeting some charter member of the church, and actually you're talking about a Trenton Crossing charter member. You're not going very far back in history anyway. We've only been here for a couple of years or so, but if you don't know someone, just introduce yourself. It's part of what we're all about. I think that visiting before the welcome and visiting after a final song ought to be vitally important parts of our whole coming together. And someone again might ask, is that really the proper focus? And I would say that, yeah, I think so. Because God is calling us to bond together as a family and to increase this fellowship. You know, some mornings you walk in here, and I've talked to others, and Frank and I particularly talk about it, and you just hear that buzz going. And some mornings you just know. I don't know what's the difference between that morning and another morning, but you walk in and you can literally hear the fellowship, and you can feel it. I believe that buzzing noise, before we start, quote unquote, I think it's a pleasing sound in the ears of God. People enjoying being, I gotta go to church. We gotta go. What time is it? Can we be? No, I want to be there. Why do you want to be there? Well, an obvious answer is to worship God, of course, but I want to be there because that's where my family is. That's where God's family is, and we connect. And again, I think that's something that even our visitors, and I hope, can see about us, that this is what we do. And if there's some things that they don't know, we can help them along the way. There's an order of worship. There's a slide that talks about why we take communion or the way we do. And here's something about our giving. Just little things that are out there. And you say, well, I don't need that slide. That's fine. It's not for you. It's for someone who does need it. Well, I know I understand that. It goes both ways. It is about us. It's about them. It's about him. It's all of those in the same package. And then we leave. And we need to be building relationships outside of just this time together. And it might start with this family, where we get together among ourselves, smaller groups, not at 10 o'clock Sunday morning. One way that's done is in a little bit more organized fashion with our life groups, where you meet here, you meet there, different places, different times across the city. But get this, it doesn't even have to be organized. It doesn't have to be in the bulletin. Maybe we should just set as our goal to be the most disorganized people you could ever imagine. There's a place for both. There's a place for organized, structured meetings, here, somewhere else. And then we get together, why? Just because we like each other. Because we're friends. Because we enjoy one another's company. It's a group effort. It's edification. It's building up. It's spiritual bodybuilding. It's building up the whole family of God. The whole body needs to be built up. May I repeat that? The whole body needs to be built up, and that means when we do come together as a whole body, there's going to be some give and take that goes on. See, when we come together, it's not about me, it's about us. See, this give and take business, that can be a tricky thing. Who gives and who takes? How are you going to define those words? What give and take means is this: no one person calls the shots. It's not about one person. It's about us. It actually means when we are together, we are thinking about each other. When we are planning the time together, we are thinking about one another. I'm reminded of some words that Paul wrote to the Philippians in chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, and you see those words, consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look out not only for your own interests, but also to the interests of others. See, even when we come together to worship, it's not about my personal preferences. It's about us. I'll mention a couple of examples. I've already mentioned meeting and greeting one another. Now, you might say, I don't need that. That's not my thing. Walk around shaking hands, introducing. Okay, I'm with you there. It's not your thing. What's your second point? Not my preference. I understand. What's your point? Is it possible that something that's not your thing might really mean something deeply to someone else, might really connect. When you say it's not my thing, then you've done exactly what I'm talking about. You're focusing on me. It's my thing, not my thing. How about, is it her thing or his thing? Well, no, it's not about I, and it's not about me. It's about us. And maybe something like that. Have you considered what you're speaking to someone might mean? Well, I don't think that. Did you say, I don't think that way? No, it's not about what you think. It's about us. I can mention 100 examples. That's just one. But when we come together, there's give and there's take. I'll bring up something else. The songs that we sing. You know, everyone has their preference. Some of those preferences are generational. Sometimes the preference is connected with a particular event. You know, your grandmother's funeral. Or I was baptized, and I remember, I don't know what it is that makes certain songs connect with people, or a certain type of song, a certain genre. And I'm not going to have an argument up here about that, or discussion as to why your genre is crummy. No, because it's not about that. It's not about that. It's about us. I have my preferences too. But I don't feel that this is the place for me to lay out my preferences in something like that. And when I understand that it's not about me, or you like something for this reason or that reason, then, perhaps if I go outside of myself, I can appreciate that. And here's a song that I don't care for at all, but I know how much it means to sister or to brother. Or I've even heard him talk about that and how much it connects. And you see, I'm getting outside of myself because it's not about me. It's about us. Outside of these gatherings, listen to whoever, whatever you want to. Praise God. When we come together, it's give, it's take, because it is not about me. It is about us. Our goal when we plan is to try to make everybody miserable. No, that's not true. But we understand the order of worship that you look at. You may say, well, I would have changed that. Well, I would have changed that. Those are the discussions we have as we're planning. That's part of it. I'll mention this, and we plan every weekend. You're welcome to join us on Wednesday nights before Bible class. Anybody can come in there and give your input, and sometimes we say yes, sometimes we don't. We don't accept. It's back and forth. It's a group, because it's not about one person. It's about us. And when we come together, there's always going to be give and take, because it is about the body. It's about spiritual body building. And everything that happens, especially at this building, these places on Sunday morning, it needs to be about building one another up. That's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Here's what he said in the first two verses of Romans 15. We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak, not to please ourselves. Each of us should please his neighbor to his good, to build him up. And 2,000 years after Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, the principle that he laid down, it remains. What goes on here week in and week out? It's about edification. It's about building up. Worshiping God, of course, I understand that, but the focus is on the body and building up the body. And as you keep on reading in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, you see that Paul tells even those inspired tongue speakers in the congregation, they were to take turns in sharing their messages. Why? So that they could be understood, so that at the end of the day, so that the church would be built up. That was the purpose for it all. You can all prophesy, verse 31, in turn, so that everyone will be instructed and encouraged. I'll put it this way. We'll put it up on the screen. Our times together need to be times of instruction and encouragement. Now, I'll do what I can to lay out some instruction when we come together. Of course, when we come together, there must be a focus on God's Word. When we assemble together as His people and there's no Bible anywhere, we've missed something greatly. There's got to be a focus on the Word. But there also needs to be a focus on these times being a time of encouragement. I remind you of the words that Eric shared with us earlier from the 10th chapter of Hebrews. those last verses, 24 and 25, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together. And the old King James, forsaking not the assembling of yourselves together. That verse is not simply saying, don't skip church. It's saying, don't get out of that habit. Let us instead encourage one another. Use these times together to encourage one another. And if we're not here, we can't do that. All the more as you see the day approaching. I hope that you learn something every time we assemble together. I've said many times, I'll say it again, I don't know that what I'm doing up here most Sundays is telling you all that much that is new. I don't know how many weeks someone leaves and goes, wow, I never saw that one or never thought about that before. But it is to remind you, to pull out of this and to pull you into this. I hope you're encouraged. I also hope that you're edified. I hope that every time we come together, mutual, spiritual bodybuilding is taking place. That we consider each other more than we consider ourselves. That flies in the face of human nature, but we're not called to human nature. We're called to spirit nature, to God nature. I hope that we are being transformed into greater servants of God week in and week out, and that we leave each week a little stronger than we were when we came in. And we keep on doing our exercises all through the week. And so I ask, are you doing your part to help that happen? 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings for starters, but all through the week where we truly love and care for and encourage each other as a family. Are you part of this family? Every time we come together, ask that question, we give you an opportunity to become a part of this family on Jesus' terms, to be born again into His spiritual family, to be baptized into Christ, to go into that water, to be resurrected from that water, to walk in a new life. And you come up out of that water and, what's the term? Born again. Born into what? A family where we love and encourage and support one another. If you need to become part of the family of God this morning, we can witness your baptism into Christ. If you need to ask for prayers from this family, we can come to the throne of God together as a family. Let's take seriously our mission of building one another up as the family of God. If you have a need that you need to request or to share with this family, you can do it right now while we stand and sing this song together.